distinct and provocative and informative, Mr. Peter Greenaway.
Okay, hello again. I'm rather glad to saw the film first and then listen to me speak afterwards. You've just watched, I suppose, a characteristic cinematic format. 2 hours long, made on a single screen, and seen in a ridiculous place like this. I mean, just consider what you do as a cinema audience. First of all, you're sitting in the dark. What the fuck are you doing sitting in the dark? Man is not a nocturnal animal. And then, just to paraphrase, I suppose, the greatest director of the middle 20th century, Godard, says you're all concentrated looking in one direction on a parallelogram, 4 right angles. So that means your vision is all coming in this direction. So it probably means that 270 degrees of your experience is around the back of your head. So just think how much physiologically, and we are deeply physiological, that you're missing out on, shall we say, human experience. And also it's obligatory, isn't it, not? There's some, I suppose, faults in the statement I'm about to make if you're all Rocky Horror Show fans. But basically, there is a concern for you to remain concentrated and static and basically, should we say, in a social milieu circumstances, to be civilized and to acknowledge the people on your either side, etc. So what have we got? You're sitting in the dark, looking in one direction and being very, very still for 120 minutes. And we played this curious game of cinema for a long time. And I think one of the curious things that I had never really come across people who thought about it like this, but how this space is inimical, is antagonistic to looking at movies. You know, maybe we should have redesigned notions of cinema a long time ago. But I'm sure this place would be absolutely familiar to Lumiere or Méliès or all those guys working in 1895, 1900. And isn't it strange that we have persisted in continuing with this relationship? You're all seated on a ramp, and you're all looking in one direction, and the screen is vertical. Okay, maybe, you know, the circumstances of technology were not sophisticated enough more than 20 years ago to make a rearrangement of that. But we've elected this particular relationship. And I think now is the time to change all this. But I don't think even in a way we're agents of this change, because you must all be aware that change is taking place anyway. The people who invited me very kindly to this film festival pat themselves on the back and say their audiences are larger than they've ever been before. But this is very, very local. You know, in Western Europe now, most young people of the laptop generation, they've given up going to the cinema. They don't even watch broadcast television anymore. You know, we all know, we don't have to sort of continually talk about it, but the whole social imaging, social communication phenomenon of the screen has really taken over the prime position of the way we use this notion of projection. And I think, you know, that's a way in which filmmakers very, very seriously have to consider that if they want to hang on to audiences. Nokia have just given me 2 million euros to make a movie on this thing. I'm not unique. Many other people, filmmakers, are doing the same thing. Now, obviously, if I can make a movie for this, I'm going to lose questions of scale. I'm going to lose questions of communication in some ways. But there's a way that you have to make an arrangement, if you like. I know if I make a film on this and it's successful, it's only going to be 120 minutes long, because you're probably going to have to watch this film at a tram stop or when you're sitting on the loo after breakfast in the morning. So there's a way I've got to change the time frame. I've got to be concerned about the midday sun. I can't afford to play with too much color range. I'm going to have to be concentrated on notions, certainly of contrast, and obviously I'm going to lose scale. But just think, I can get a film to my friends in Beijing in 28 seconds. And what is the purpose of making communication of any sort is to make sure the audience has a way as quickly as possible and as elegantly as possible to receive what you want to do. So I'm prepared, of course, to be able to trade in notions of high contrast, brilliant color, amazing sound, and certainly large 2001 scale in order to make those communications. But of course, I'm not really telling you the truth, am I? I'm, in an extraordinary, I suppose, extraordinary privileged position because of the nature of my cinema, and I think you can understand this. There's a way, it's probably ideal for a certain sort of current 21st century phenomenon, is the way how we can slip and slide between media. I can make a website and I can turn it into an opera. I can make an opera and turn it into a theatrical performance. I can make a theatrical performance and make a film. And there's a way, indeed, that this maneuverability, this ability to metamorphise, means that we're not stuck with one singularity, with one particular circumstance. I don't know, I am fascinated, as you can see from the film you've just seen, about notions of religion and belief and faith versus reason and all those things. And people warned me to be careful about shouting about atheism when I come to America. Your president still says God bless America after every speech. I don't really know what he means by that. I don't think you do either. But there is a way, isn't there, that there is a brand new sort of secularization abroad. And we have to look in a curious way for new ideas about the Trinity. The Trinity, God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Ghost. There is a new Trinity now. It's the mobile phone, the laptop, and the camera recorder. And if you're all good theologians, you will know that Christianity, around about 600, began to combine the notion of the Trinity into one singularity. So we're just waiting now, and especially in this city, I understand, for Microsoft to be able to grapple with this new Trinity and make it one phenomenon, and I'm sure we're on our way already. The Trinity, in its old Roman Catholic sense, is an empowering vehicle responsible for communication and cultural necessities. And there's a way, of course, we've handed over, without necessarily being too glib, from those sorts of entities, which are in some ways based on faith as much as on notions of reason, into a new technological world which we're all part of. Let me ask a question. Is there anybody in this room who does not have a mobile phone or does not have a laptop? Two gentlemen here. Okay, I'd certainly like to... can you read? Can you read? You can read.
I have a master's degree, and I'd like to like to read.
No, you remember Gore Vidal said, what's the population of America? 360 million, but there are only about 20,000 people who read. I think you can understand, if you've got a master's degree, what he meant. I mean, really read. Not superficially look at the words, but really read. I think that's not so surprising. It's not necessarily a characteristic of America. I think it's probably true all over the world. And even at those very high points of extremely sophisticated culture, Heian dynasty in Japan, Louis XIV, Versailles, even the Weimar Republic, the proportion of people, should we say, as Gore Vidal suggests, who read as merely to look at the words, has always basically been the same. It's a bit like our museums. They say, don't they, that our museums only contain about 3% of what man has ever made. What on earth happened to the other 97%? But maybe it's a good thing, because where the hell would we put all that stuff? But these sorts of proportions, I suppose, and you can see why I would say this, because in a curious way it's a reflection of a course, as you can imagine. A huge barrage of criticism comes my way. In fact, it came my way curiously. I hope this man doesn't object to me repeating what he said. There was a suggestion that the language, the vocabulary, the syntax, the precepts, the concepts that are alive and well, I'd like to think, in the film that you just saw, are elitist, are privatized, are part of a very privileged education, which it would seem that civilization is now very rapidly eroding. It's my belief, as I suggested at the end of the last film, that there's no such thing as history, there's only historians. So the feeling that all history and cultural concerns are deeply, deeply subjective, and there's a rollover effect happening all the time. I've just been invited to make an exhibition about the sacrifice of Isaac at Liebeskin's new museum, Jewish museum in Berlin. But it's ironic, although this is a profound statement, not only for Jews and Christians, but also for Islamic cultures, very important set of mythologies, if you like, biblical theological examinations. But it's interesting, when you push the button on internet and look for the sacrifice of Isaac, up comes the board game, which you could play on the internet. It's like, you know, in the old days, when you push the word Donatello, you've got a picture of a turtle. This will almost inevitably change and be rearranged, but, you know, let's go with the flow and find the best possible way to developing and organizing that. You know, examination of our language, for example, a single language, and what are there, about 5,000 languages in the world, and I think by Shakespeare's time there was something like 21,000 languages, so we've lost an awful lot of languages in the mere 450 years. But even, you know, various forms of English spoken around the world, they lose 20% of their vocabulary every 100 years. So in 500 years, the whole vocabulary has changed. So I think we should not be fearful about the so-called loss, in inverted commas, of cultural information, because it's always in a curious way there, but it's been metamorphized or changed or transformed. And again, you know, thank God that's happening, because it means the whole activity is alive, is alive, is alive. And that's what I would like to think of war, I suppose, a certain sort of introduction to what I want to say now. I suspect the most revered and respected filmmaker in America is still Scorsese. Is that true? Do you think he's lost that popularity he had, what, 20 years ago in Mean Streets, etc.? I was always brought up on the fact that Scorsese was the most respected American filmmaker by Americans. But you know, Scorsese, however much we can offer that gentleman respect, basically still makes the same films as Griffith. Still having those, you know, dominant characteristics. Psychological drama, the fight of good and evil, and the notion of Christian ethic to move from a sense of negativity to positivity, what you Americans would call a happy ending. I don't think Europeans make films with happy endings. They make resolutions, but they're not often very happy. But in any case, this sort of sensation of moving from negativity to positivity. You might argue, and I'm sure there are a lot of literati in the audience, that after all is the ways and means perhaps the European novel has been going ever since Jane Austen, if not before. But that continuum is still with us, isn't it? You know, what is different? Okay, we've certainly thrown away celluloid, but in a sense we're still playing that game, that Chekhovian late Russian theatrical game of the aquarium with the glass wall, where we are the people outside the aquarium looking at the goldfish who are lit inside the aquarium. Here it is. Here's the aquarium's fourth wall. But we're still playing, in a sense, with the same way that Chekhov would have used actors, this whole notion of pretense. An actor, excuse me, I'm going to quote the actor who came up to me just now, asking about the notion of, well, I suppose, actors in cinema. I suspect there are other actors in the audience too. Is that not true? Because I'm going to insult you now. I always think the best definition of an actor, or indeed an actress, is somebody who's been trained to pretend that they're not being watched. That's what we use them for, isn't it? And as soon as that pretense breaks down, we accuse them of bad acting. But more of that anon. Let me go back to the reason why I mentioned Scorsese. That in a curious way, cinema is a remarkably slow-moving, very conservative phenomenon. It's supposed to have been invented in 1895. I will put up a theory that was invented in 1642 when four extremely valuable Western painters, Caravaggio, Rubens, Rembrandt, and Velázquez, began for the very first time in a sophisticated way to paint artificial light. What is cinema? It's only about the manipulation of artificial light. But there are some historians, of course, who would even set up the invention of cinema in about 300 BC in China, when you start talking about shadow play and so on. So maybe we're wrong to suddenly pretend that cinema actually did begin in 1895. But even if it did, let's take it as a note. Just think, who is painting in 1895? Well, Van Gogh is still alive, and now we are post-Andy Warhol. Who is making music in 1895? Well, Schubert is certainly dead. Wagner is just dead. It's certainly before all those 12-tone players of the 20th century. But now we have what, post-Boulez, post-Stockhausen, post-Philip Glass. Just think what's happened in terms of painting, in terms of music, from the beginnings, 1895, to now, 2013. Huge changes in language perspective. What on earth is the equivalent in cinema? What has cinema done that could possibly equate with the revolutions that have happened in other art forms? It's also very interesting if you think about those two phenomena, because the biggest revolution, I suppose, in painting is to become non-figurative. Could you ever imagine Rembrandt or Leonardo da Vinci ever thinking of non-figuration in painting? Almost impossible to believe. So there's a way in which a lot of people would have thought that figuration and painting went hand in hand and could not be separated. And then if you think again of the activities of Schoenberg and Baird and Beethoven and people like that, and go back to Beethoven and imagine music without harmony would be impossible. But then along comes these guys and changes everything. What has been the great change? What has been the turning of the plow in terms of filmmaking? It's extremely difficult to think what that might be. And that, of course, is the prologue to what I want to say. I think, just as painting got rid of figuration, music got rid of harmony, now cinema has to get rid of narration. Thank you for that lone clapping. I don't know, why do you go to the cinema? Do you go to the cinema to be told a story? Is that why you go to the cinema, to be told a story? And if you did, in a curious way, why don't you stay at home and read a book? You know, the big events, I suppose, in Western cinema in the last 15 years are Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter. And we know these really aren't films, are they? They're illustrated books. You can go down to the marketplace and you can buy these two books very, very easily. But it's the same with Eisenstein, the same with Griffiths, it's the same with all the other, I suppose, hero directors you have, even the ones that I have and regard enormously highly, people indeed like Godard. So what this means, in a sense, is we have a text-based industry. We have a text-based industry. Every film, almost without exception, you've seen, started life with a text. Why is cinema so insecure that it has to be so text-based? You know, again, I've said this so many times, and maybe I've said it in front of you before, but there is a way in which text is so rich in the ways it can be promulgated. Think of poetry for the last 8,000 years, think of the novel form, and primarily think of theatre, which hands its meaning down in text, not in image, essentially. Why can't we allow a particular medium, let's call it cinema, to have the ability, autonomous ability, to be able to create itself of itself, so it becomes a self-supporting thing? But it's not true, of course. I mean, cinema is a bastard, it's a mongrel. I think those apologists in the 1920s in Belgium said that cinema was a combination of the theatre, literature, and if you're very, very lucky, painting. The definition really hasn't changed, has it? You think of all the products, both orthodox and unorthodox, official and unofficial, independent, although again, independent is a very dirty word now. You know, what films are really truly independent, or indeed what films ever have been truly independent. So there's a way that cinema knows this weakness because it's always going back to the bookshop, always going back to the bookshop. And I think one of the absolute essential things we have to do is to break that cord. And this, of course, brings me to really, really big subject matters. Let me ask you, an audience, again. I can't see people at the back very well. Is there a way we can turn the lights up a bit so I can see my audience? Is that possible? Can anybody in the projection box hear me? No answer. They've all gone for coffee. Which is this question? Which in question, you know, about notions of visual literacy, visual literacy. The reason I wanted to see you is I'm going to ask you a question. How many people, in fact, feel that they are visually literate? Another way of asking that question, how many people have been to art school, or to design college, or architectural school? Can you put your hands up? Okay, I can't really see at the back, but I'm judging, presuming, when I always ask that question. Thank you. When I ask that question in many, many audiences, and all sorts of descriptions, probably about, it's been calculated about 8% of the audience put their hands up. So only 8%. So what about all the rest of you? Can I accuse the rest of you then of being visually illiterate? So if you think about it, you know, we're all incredibly sophisticated in handling text, aren't we? Both spoken and written. It's rather strange because I'm speaking to an English-speaking audience, and I often speak to non-English-speaking audiences, and so there are translators along here. So when I ask that question, of course, it has a more complicated answer to it. But even across all the language barriers, you know, we're dead sophisticated in being able to communicate that, because that's the main way in which the education systems of the world have behaved. Umberto Eco, Italian guru, suggested that the world and civilization as we know it, most prominently perhaps in the West rather than the East, is being created by the text masters. The text masters have written our holy books. They've written all our books of morals and ethics. They've written all the instruction books that we're ever likely to use, whether to build the United States battleship or tie a baby navy. It's all written down, and normally by men, of course. So 8,000 years of male text masters. And Umberto Eco, who's a great supporter of the digital revolution and believes it's primarily a visual phenomenon, he argues that these text masters at last now seriously have to move aside and allow the image masters and finally the image mistresses to come forward and to really make a big contribution so that the balances and the arrangements and the strategies of our cultural civilization will inevitably change. A text is not an image. And we've ended up, let me repeat again, with a cinema which is basically illustrational. Illustration to me, and I hope to be a primary creator, illustration is a dirty word. I don't want to simply illustrate an idea. I want to search for the primary purpose of the circumstances of an image and to prioritize that as an image, not simply as a piece of illustrated text. That, of course, is very, very difficult because our educational systems are arranged like that. It must surely be your experience, as it was mine, and certainly the experience of my children. When you come about 11, 12, something like that, the teacher says, you know, put away the crayons, put away the easel, get serious, now you're going to have to concentrate on text. I was reading in an in-flight magazine a couple of days ago that life expectancy of a baby born in the last 18 months is 120 years. Okay, you put down your crayon, you throw away your easel, age 10. You've got 110 years of being, in a sense, visually illiterate. Because these people, well, I say these people, us, I can't really say it about me, because the 8% of the audience share my experience, because I went to art school. But let's say, you know, that the majority, I mean, let's say at least at least 50%, and I think I'm being very generous on the wrong side of the coin, it means that these people never, in a sense, engaged, either theoretically or certainly not practically, in the business of really getting to grips, intelligently spending time with the notion of understanding an image, first of all, and secondarily, no obligation to do this, but being able to be in a position to make those images. That does really suggest to me an enormous impoverishment. As a film director, people often come up to me and say, I want to be in your film, Mr. Greenaway, but I can't draw, I can't sing, and I can't dance. Well, that's ridiculous, of course. Everybody can sing, everybody can draw, everybody can dance. Nobody's asking you to do it to Olympic standards. And isn't it interesting? I was talking about the new Trinity. The ability of the laptop and the mobile phone and the camcorder of some description is beginning to empower us and to kill the elitism of the construction of what we would describe, I suppose, as cinema and all its sisters and brothers and cousins. If you were happened to be alive in Periclean Athens, 300 BC, you could probably argue that there might be one artist to every million people. By the time that Gutenberg is creating his printing press, you could probably say there might be, 10 artists to every million people. French Revolution, 200 artists. Beginning of the First World War, I don't know, maybe 25,000. End of the Second World War, I don't know, maybe what? I'm pulling these figures out of the air, of course. But you get the drift. There's a way that the empowerment of cultural manufacture has increased and increased and increased, very largely due to education, which has been the responsibility very largely of the great success story of liberal democracy, which is happily spreading and spreading and spreading very, very fast. Even Mr. Bush should point to the gun. But now, with a possibility again of having these technical tools, which, apart from that gentleman there and that gentleman there who don't possess them, all of you have, and they are empowering. They have to be empowering, don't they? Remember again when I say that, our museums are only full of 3% that ever man-made, etc. So we have to keep that equation in mind. So there could be a way, couldn't there, in the future, there simply won't be a minority of cultural manufacturers within a given population number, but there'll be 1 million creators in 1 million people. And in a curious way, isn't that what we all want? Have to be careful here again, reminding ourselves of the 3% in museums. Apart from then, these two gentlemen, I'm going to really victimize you two now. We've all got one of these again, have we not, in our pockets. So I bet you all use it all the time to take photographs. So at any singular time of the year, there are millions and millions and millions and millions of photographs being taken recording our world. But is it not ironic that probably there are only 50, let's say 100, there are only 100 recognized good photographers in the world? How do we equate those sorts of balances? But remember, I'm not asking you as a photographer with your mobile phone to be of Olympic standards. The very fact that you're engaged in that phenomenon is part of a creative process and a creative richness which surely has to be important. One of my great Roman heroes was Vitruvius, architect. I think Augustus died, so he was alive about the time of Tiberius, so we're talking about AD 60. He suggested the very, very best education for an architect and also a gentleman. I have to be careful here because the ideal gentleman is an Englishman. It's no accident that most English architecture of the 17th and 18th century was deeply, deeply influenced by Vitruvius, through people like Palladio and so on. Because he said then that the education for an architect was so all-empowering because you had to know everything about everything. You had to know about building materials, you had to know about money, you had to know about clients and politics, you had to understand posterity, you had to know all the golden rules of aesthetics, etc., etc., etc. He also added, of course, in a curious way, though it might be the best education for a gentleman, it was a lousy proposition for an architect. He said that because knowing everything about everything is terribly soul-destroying. If I can turn this little anecdote personally, I went to art school in London for 4 years. I went in as a very, very jolly and excited, overexcited 17-year-old. He came out 4 years later deeply, deeply depressed, and I didn't paint again for another 5 years. And I'm sure this experience is not entirely unknown to a lot of you. There's a way that all this intensity and self-criticism and peer group pressure turns the joy of creation into some sort of chore. In a curious way, you have to relive the whole thing again to get back on even feet. But the reason I'm telling you this anecdote, for Vitruvius and architecture in AD 60, let's consider the proposition of the education of a filmmaker now. A filmmaker supposedly has to have all those knowledges about everything, surely the ideal filmmaker, more so than any other artist. So I've often thought that filmmaking will be the absolute ideal education for those people who wish to be empowered by visual literacy. But look who we've all ended up with. Do you really think that cinema has fulfilled the enormous imaginative possibilities as were established by all those enormously enthusiastic cinematic apologists of the 1910s and 1920s who believed it would be the art form of the total human imagination? I think now most cinema is basically bedtime stories for adults. And there is a way that the slavery of the notion of narrative, the slavery of the architecture of this space, the slavery, in a sense, of this screen, have really, rather like the experiences at art schools and architectural colleges, in some funny way have killed that spirit. I suppose it's quite difficult for me to stand here having just shown you a film and you're all partaking in a Seattle Film Festival to be able to, I suppose, convince you of this. But I suppose it's all leading up to, I suppose, the deliberate provocation, which I'm sure you've heard before, and I'm not alone in this, that basically cinema is dead now. I think it's dead for all those obvious reasons about the economic activity, the ubiquity of the democratization of the tools, the way that distribution is organized, the easy access in a curious way to cinema. These are all sort of obvious things which I don't, in a sense, have to underline. But having already spoken to you, I suppose, across a range of different activities, in the early 1990s, I became very, very disenchanted about cinema. It was not satisfying all those things that I wanted it to do. And I, for myself, very personally to begin with, far too embarrassed to offer it to audiences, but I came up with a proposition of four tyrannies which have destroyed cinema from within and are continuing to do so. We've touched on these already. I don't think that cinema can afford to continue to be a text-based medium, which means we have to seriously consider the questions of narrativity. Let me explain that just a little more. I'm sure all of you could probably give me a one-sentence answer to explain what is Star Wars about, what is Spider-Man about, what is Casablanca about, whatever your favorite film or indeed your non-favorite film. You probably have to give me a very, very quick gloss, but that's it. It'll all be over. Your description will be over in a few seconds. Because I don't really seriously believe for you that narrativity is really very important in cinema. It's not something which impinges on you and will not let you go. What we remember about cinema is a particular audio-visual sensation, some happenstance, a collective total experience of landscape versus performance, of a moment of time. And we all, I don't know, let's take one of my favorite films, Blade Runner. You know, I don't remember the plot. Okay, I give you a very brief gloss. But I don't really remember the ins and outs and the confabulation and the dialogue. It's not what I remember. But I'm sure most of you in this room have seen Blade Runner, and we can easily talk about those magic moments that stay with you forever and forever. So why do we need this intense concern for narrative in cinema? It's just back to that idea, you know. painting Lucy's figuration and music uses harmony. Now I think it's about time we shocked all script writers and film writers. We really need to readdress this phenomenon. So, tyranny of one. I think that cinema has to break the umbilical cord to the bookshop. Tyranny number two, I've already, in a sense, I suppose, mentioned, is the tyranny of this frame. When I look at you and you look at me, I do not see you in a frame, and you do not see me in a frame. So a frame is a man-made construction, and anything that's man-made can be unman-made. One of the curious things of apologists for the frame says, it represents insides and outsides, so it's the window. But you know, there's a very, very bad art history there. Most windows in Western architecture are north-south. They weren't ever remotely east-west until about the 1920s. So I'm sure that idea, that solution, completely collapses. But I've also got, a gyroscopic head and eyes that never stop. You must remember those films of car drivers looking directly into people's eyes, and you're amazed how the eyes never ever stop moving. I think the only time the eyes stop moving is when you're dead. So we have a moving phenomenon, but look what we've done with that potentiality. We've frozen it into a single frame here. How can that possibly be a representation of our human visual experience? I think we have to do something about the rigidity of this notion of the frame. You cineasts will know there have, of course, been many experiments. You know the name Abel Gance, who made an extraordinary film called Napoleon, who started breaking up the ability to that, not to give you one frame, but to give you 3 frames. It was an experiment that didn't go very far because it's